Welcome back to the Los Angeles Times newsroom. I'm Pat Morrison. It is about 2.5 hours until the polls close in the historic California gubernatorial recall election, our second in 20 years. You may remember back that far. And your opportunity to talk to our expert staff with your questions about the election. Still time for you to vote if you have not. As of just about now, 9.5 million California registered voters have returned those mail-in ballots that went out to every registered voter as a consideration of COVID to avoid gatherings. And now we'll find out beginning in about 2.5 hours how some of those ballots are turning out, and by the end of the evening perhaps an answer as to whether Gavin Newsom will stay on as governor of California, will be booted from office, and if so, who would be replacing him from a field of more than 40 different candidates. Very different from the 130 plus when Gray Davis was recalled from office in 2003. And Ask a Reporter is the theme of the evening. You get a double-barreled theme right now with Gustavo Arellano. Not only a reporter to ask, but his Ask a Mexican column put him on the map for people who didn't know about him and who obviously should have. Now he's a columnist at the LA Times. Gustavo, gracias for being here.
Hola, Pat.
Look, there you are in your jam-packed book studio. And you're not wearing the hat. You had the opportunity to join me in wearing a hat tonight, and you didn't.
I can't pull off hats the way you do, although I got to get you 100X Tejana. That's what I need to give you.
All right. I promise I will put it on, and we'll get photographed together when they allow that sort of thing. So there's an enormous voting demographic, of voting bloc in California of Latino voters, not monolithic, has not tended to be Republican, but you're finding some interesting numbers as the recall is breaking about who is in favor of what and what issues in particular may be separating Latino voters from Gavin Newsom.
Yeah, the last poll that was released by the LA Times and the Berkeley Institute showed that Latinos are still the minority now that's most in favor of the recall are Native Americans, but no one's ever writing about that. But Latinos, which they at one point of the recall, 50% of them, a majority of them, were in favor of the recall. Then the number reduced to about 31%, still pretty significant, higher than Asian voters, higher than Black voters. But to me, what was most interesting is seeing the disparity in generation. 10% of the voters surveyed were Spanish dominant. Only 10% of them were in favor of the recall. English dominant voters, 38%, only 3 percentage points away from white voters who favor the recall, which I think that's something that Democrats need to study no matter what happens with the recall today and tonight, and figure out like what on earth is going on that Democrats or Latinos are not automatically voting Democrat the way we have been telling the rest of the country for the past quarter century that they would.
And interestingly, it does seem to be generational. And while you have had a Republican Party that hasn't really done much to move toward Latinos, Latinos in that older generation perhaps have been moving more toward the Republican Party. What's behind that?
And it's not even the older generation. I'm talking about even younger people than me, the bros, so to speak, the Latino bros. Why? It's not just white men who are bros, by the way. Some of the most broy bros that I know are from like Montebello or from Santana or whatever, all jacked up in the Dodge Chargers and all swollen stuff. But what's happening? I've been writing about this in my column for the past year. This idea, I coined the term Rancho libertarianism. So you're having these voters, these young men, especially men, whose parents came from Mexico, who came from the rural part of Mexico, like my parents. So they have these conservative libertarian values. They're not anti-immigrant though, because a lot of their parents came here without papers. They made stuff of themselves, but they don't want to hear from the Democrats anymore that Latinos are victims, because it's very much to pull themselves up by the bootstraps mentality that's not popular to believe in anymore. But for these young men, for these Latino voters, it's still their mantra. And so they might not necessarily like the Republicans, but they don't want to hear about Gavin Newsom anymore. They don't want to hear about those woke politics anymore. They want to just be left alone for the most part. And that's where they didn't like the shutdowns. They don't like COVID mandates. And frankly, they also don't like Gavin Newsom, who they consider to be elite.
So it is COVID shutdowns. Is it also school choice, or the fact that the kids are still home from school in many school districts because COVID has not been gotten well in hand?
That's something that's a concern. Of course, all parents, they want better schools. For some kids, they have been better at home than they have been at school themselves. But more than anything, I'm seeing the people that I talk to, it's not so much an embrace of Republican QAnon politics, although that's there as well, or the pandejos, the people who refuse to be vaccinated. We know, of course, Latinos for a long time were not getting vaccinated at all.
Well,
It
let's
really is a rejection of what the Democrats have been practicing in California here, especially in the past couple of years. The Democrats have been really focusing on the most, the most working class of Latinos, the undocumented folks, the poorest folks, all of that. So they're helping the leftist part of the Democratic Party, but they're not paying attention to the center. You always have to pay attention to the center. You always have to pay attention to the middle class. That's why you saw that drift in 2020 of Latino voters for Trump after 4 years of probably the most xenophobic, anti-Mexican president since, William Howard Taft. No, Woodrow Wilson. He's the one who sent troops down to Mexico, to Pershing down in Mexico, go after Pancho Villa. You would expect Trump's Latino voters ranks to crater. Not only did it stay, which wasn't that much, but actually increased. So Democrats, they know that there's a problem there. They just do not want to acknowledge it because you still have the supermajority of Latinos going Democrat. But if you don't address that at some point, watch out.
I want you to unpack that portmanteau word pandejos. Pandemic and pendejos.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Pandemic, pendejo, bandejo. I did not invent the term, but I am very much its biggest acolyte. I was using it more when in the early rollout of the vaccine, where there was a lot of Latinos who were not taking the vaccine. And I said, look, like, we got to take this vaccine. We are the community, one of the communities that are most affected by it. We should know better. And yet in the early days, we were not knowing better. Vaccination rates have improved. We're still lagging behind other groups, but still, anywhere I go, if I, as a public voice, I like to say pandejo. I still say though in private voice, you got to convince a vaccine hesitant with peace and love.
And we can call pendejo jerk. Does that work?
Yeah, okay. Pendejo is just a harsh term for a jerk. Yes, it is not a curse word. It allows me to print it, so it's definitely not a curse word.
So as we see California in a bluer and bluer tide, this element of the Latino constituency, the Latino electorate pushing the other way, moving the other way, is that an opening that the rest of the country, particularly Republicans, are looking at as an opportunity?
Absolutely. And it's not just, of course, in California. In South Texas, like some of the most Latino counties in the United States, we're talking about 90% Latino, they actually either swung very close to Trump or they voted for Trump over Biden. And that just created a whole bunch of thought pieces on why this is going on. Imperial County was also, I think it was a county in California that saw the biggest flip in voters from Democrat to the Republican. Biden still won, but still in Imperial County, we know is right on the border, very Latino, or very Latino, and still was inching closer to Trump. I just think for the Democrats, look, and you have more Democrats now in the California legislature than ever before. It's a powerhouse there. Maria Elena Salinas. Sorry, I'm thinking of all the names. Maria Elena Durazo, Wendy Carrillo, Anthony Rendon, the Speaker of the California Assembly Speaker. All big names there. They've been working off of the legacy of Proposition 187, the 1994, the infamous 1994 ballot initiative that sought to make life miserable for undocumented immigrants, but instead inspired an entire generation of Latinos to vote Democrat. But the Democratic Party cannot, to make people not vote Republican, can't be pointing and saying, they're going to make life more miserable for you. We've been hearing it for 25 years. Is life exactly a bowl of cherries with a pie in the sky for all Latinos? No. And sadly, I would say Gavin Newsom did try his best to try to wrangle this pandemic, but all vote with what they see in front of them. And if Latinos see misery and economic devastation, well, yeah, they're going to vote. They're going to be against Gavin, and more of them, more are going to be voting for the recall than you would think.
Then what does that do going forward on the assumption that the recall fails? What does that do for the Latino leadership in California, which may have been used to coasting a little because they've got kind of cushy numbers and they didn't really have to worry about making much of an appeal across the board, whether it's policies or politics?
The Republicans right now still don't get it because the Republicans are always clueless about Latinos. The Republicans are like that blind pig trying to find the truffle, except the blind pig never finds a truffle because they're blind, and they still haven't developed their sense of smell yet to get to that truffle that is the Latino electorate. But all they need is one Latino candidate who's charismatic, who is not a pandejo, who is not tied to Trump. And watch out. And this is a funny thing. The Republican Party has had these every once in a while in California politics. You had a lieutenant governor last decade, Abel Maldonado. He didn't go anywhere because he came from a rural district. 30 years ago, they had a superstar in Gary Vasquez, the first ever Latino Republican, first ever Latino to be elected in the Orange County Board of Supervisors, back when Orange County was the Orange County of Reagan and whatnot. He famously spoke at the Republican National Convention in 1988 and made fun of then presidential candidate for the Democrats, Michael Dukakis, who knew how to speak Spanish. And Gary very famously said, he may speak Spanish, but he doesn't know our language. Of course, his career went down in flames because of the Orange County bankruptcy. So you get these Latino Republicans every once in a while. They just, do not pan out. The Republicans, if they ever find someone who's not going to be a disgrace, then watch out, Democrats.
And the leadership of the Democratic side in Latino politics in California, there was no Latino Democrat or any noted Democrat on the recall ballot because that was the way Gavin Newsom wanted it. But is there anybody on that side who, had the ballot been open to anybody who wanted to present himself or herself on it, would have been the newcomer for Latinos, for Democratic Latinos? Or are they all just duking it out in Sacramento?
Of course, we all know our Luke Skywalker, Antonio Villaraigosa, who spent the pandemic growing a magnificent gray mullet. Like, he came out in our LA Times series about Fernando Mania, and I'm like, damn, man, that's a good look for you, a Mexi mullet, if you will. But of course, he was not going to run against Newsom because he knows better than that. But in terms of rising stars, I mean, the big one, of course, Kevin De Leon. I think Kevin De Leon still has that chance to get into statewide politics, but I think he's probably going to want to be the mayor of Los Angeles unless Karen Bass, of course, runs for it. But like a Wendy Carrillo, she's a rising star, but I think she's still a little bit too young, even though she's not, she's my age in her, I believe, late 30s, early 40s. And then the other Latinos they're in their 50s, they're sort of the pioneers, this 187 generation. You are seeing that next generation of younger Latinos making a difference in small towns across California, like in the Coachella Valley. In 2020, I wrote this article about this dynasty of friends, literally friends who attended Coachella Valley High School or Coachella High School in the 1990s. One now, Raul Ruiz, is a Congress member. Another, Manuel Perez, he's a supervisor. Eduardo Garcia, he's an assembly member. They created an entire dynasty. So I think that's the Democratic Party is going to start plugging into them. And also, if they were smart, they got to move the seat of power down to Southern California. We've had enough Northern California power base for Democrats since the days of Hiram Johnson. We need to get some of that. Alex Padilla is a good start, but we need more of the Democratic Party power base in SoCal.
So how do you see Latino politics in California shaking out in the wake of the recall, win or lose for Gavin Newsom?
Well, Newsom has done everything possible. I mean, my colleague Gene Guerrero, of course, wrote an article saying that one of the reasons Newsom's being recalled is because he's the most pro-Latino governor in California history. I happen to agree with that. But again, like, there's still going to be a segment. I think it's not so much a problem Newsom, but it's really the Democratic Party. There's still a lot of Latinos. They don't want to hear defund the police. They don't want to hear school district. I mean, they don't want to hear school districts focusing on ethnic studies or critical race theory, whatever you want to talk about, however you want to call it, when their students are still not going to colleges, when their students still, or rather, when their children still don't have those roads for financial success in a state like California. So whoever is going to be in charge of the future, they need to figure out a way to get more Latinos up in economically, because you're going to have those Rancho libertarians, which, by the way, are successful, are in the middle class and saying, hey, we want more opportunities for our children. We do not want a Democratic Party that's obsessed with race or with social justice, even though I don't have a problem with that at all, me, myself personally. But you have to go for the middle. Newsom calling out, saying this is the Republican recall. I don't think that's smart, because you're turning off all those Latinos who maybe weren't in favor of, or are not Republicans, but were against Newsom. Now they're saying, okay, so you're against me as well. Be careful what you call out, because in the future it's going to clap back at you.
Was there a tendency, and maybe there still is, to treat all voters of color as sort of monolithic, whether they're black or Latino, and craft policies of one size fits all, when in fact that wasn't the case? And it's going to take a pretty nimble legislator to work his way or her way through that kind of challenge and to tease it out from that monolith.
What I would say is, look, Democrats, if you really want that stranglehold, you got to cover all bases. The Democrat Party used to be the big tent party. In recent years, of course, it's only bought the left entrance. They've totally shut down the right entrance as well. And so a lot of voters are becoming, if not necessarily Republican, declined to stay or no political preference or whatnot. Those are the swing voters that tonight they would be the key for the recall to succeed. Those swing voters, I still don't. I mean, we don't know the polls yet, of course, but I just in talking to people, I've seen enough anger at Newsom to know that they're out there. I mean, we got a recall for that matter, but I don't see enough anger for them to be able to pull out the race. But again, we'll see. Famous last words, right?
What are you going to look for when all the results come out for regional differences, for age, gender differences in the Latino vote, and what are you going to be able to divine from that?
We'll see. We'll see how. We'll see how granular these results may become. I want to see what cities were more for the recall, what neighborhoods, especially LA, and other. Is Pico Rivera and Paramount are a little bit more working class and say Whittier, are they going to be more for the recall or against it? Especially the rural communities in the Central Valley, down in Imperial County, out in Coachella. I also want to see where the Democratic Party has a power base. Look, I don't foresee any of these Latino majority cities being necessary, like voting for the recall, 1,000%, like for it. But I just want to see that. And also, again, I was very struck by that Berkeley LA Times poll that showed that disparity between English dominant Latinos and Spanish dominant Latinos. The Democratic Party really has thought for the past quarter century, ever since 187, that all Latinos are going to grow up and vote Democrat because that's just naturally in them. There's no way on earth. Why would they possibly want to be sellouts, vendidos, and go with the Republican Party? Well, 38% of Latino voters polled by the Times would tell you otherwise, and they would also tell you we're not sellouts. We're actually proud Latinos. I thought it was very interesting in one of his last campaign appearances, public appearances. Larry Elder was in Wilmington, working class Latino city. Behind him was Gloria Romero, who's a Democrat, a former bigwig in the state Senate. Abel Maldonado, who was a Republican, and then he got a Wilmington community leader whose name I forget right now, but he knows. I mean, he knows that's his only shot to win the swing vote of Latinos, these Rancho libertarians. As I argued in my column, I actually think Larry Elder is the most Latino candidate in the race, even though there's 5 other Latinos in the race, because he has a story like a lot of those Rancho libertarians, except he speaks against undocumented workers. He does not like them at all. If he was smart, I mean, he would turn off all the crazy alt-loser voters in the Republican Party, but then he would get a lot of Latinos by saying, I embrace, DACA, I embrace a pathway to citizenship. I would guarantee you he'd be in a far better position today than he is right now.
So wouldn't it be a paradox if Gavin Newsom survives this recall, but it in some ways emboldened the GOP for finding a way back to Latino voters?
They get this. They actually get this. The 2020 election was a roadmap because historically, I can speak especially from Orange County. In Orange County, the land where Reagan said all the good Republicans go to die, which of course flipped to an all-blue congressional delegation in 2018 for the first time ever. It's not like that anymore. But the Republicans years ago realized we're not going to get Latinos, so let's just go heavy on Asian American voters. And they were able to create history in the 2020 election with the first 2 Korean American congressional representatives ever, in Young Kim and Michelle Steele, both Korean born women. But they also did something very smart. They got as the executive director of the Republican Party of Orange County a young man named Randall Avila. Randall Avila's from, I believe he was Alhambra, Monterey Park, sort of that East LA, went to Cantwell High School, came from a working class Mexican-American family, and is Republican. I did a column about him last year, and I pressed him on it, like, come on, Randall, you're really going to be part of a party that demonized us for 25 years? And he said, yeah, I wouldn't use that language, but I think we could really show something. We could show Latinos a way forward. 2020 with Trump, we saw what happened. He stayed the course and gained a little bit with Latinos. The 2021 recall, you've seen enough Latinos be in favor of the recall that has sent shockwaves around the country. The Republicans, if they're smart, and that's a big if, they will follow that path. But if they're really smart, they got to tone down these QAnon whack job politics as represented by Larry Elder.
And yet, as you have seen in the last half dozen statewide elections, when it's come to the Republican primary, they've invariably picked the farther to the right candidate who has gotten a lot of Republican support but alienated voters in the general election.
Hopefully they learn a lesson from California. I mean, look, and the Republicans had a shot. The recall was able to be placed on the ballot in June, July. Newsom's numbers really weren't looking good. And of course, there were early polls, sure, but the Republicans had a shot. If they had just gotten a candidate, maybe like a Kevin Faulconer, who was moderate, who speak, his Spanish in his campaign commercial was way better than Larry Elder, which is because Larry Elder once bragged about how he was just amazing in a Spanish language class at Fairfax High way back in the day. If the Republicans had gotten a candidate that was a little bit more charismatic than Faulconer or something, they would have had a much better chance. Instead, they put everything into Larry Elder. Again, a guy like Larry Elder, Larry's real name is Lawrence. My dad's name is Lorenzo. So Lorenzo Elder, a lot of the stuff when Larry talks about like respectability politics, I'm like, man, that's what my dad still tells me. That's what my mom used to tell me all the time. And I'm the more liberal member of my family of cousins. So they're even more conservative. But the minute these Republicans open their mouths about, undocumented workers and not that words, even worse words, they're like, nah, I don't need to listen to Republicans. I might not like the Democrats because they're a bunch of wocosos, but I do not need to hear these anti-immigrant politics. But of course, with the recall, it's supposed to be nonpartisan. I don't think any of my cousins voted yes on the recall, but if there was a better candidate than Larry Elder, I wouldn't be surprised if some of them did.
Gustavo, thank you as always, the sage of the Los Angeles Times, Gustavo Arellano.
That shall be
como
grabbed.
siempre. Thank you, and of course we will be posting questions on the LA Times website and hearing from you in your column and your comments, not only more tonight, but also tomorrow after the recall election when all the votes are counted. Thank you, Gustavo.
Gracias.
As you know, mail-in ballots were sent to all California registered voters, 22.2 million of them, and as of today, almost half, 9.5 million of those ballots were returned. 51% of those ballots came from Democratic voters, about half of what was left from Republican voters, the other half from no party preference voters. So you see a split, and the question, of course, as always, is about turnout and whether it's Republicans who will be going to the polls in person to assert that authority and that voice rather than send in the mail-in ballots. So we are here at the Los Angeles Times in the newsroom until 8 o'clock and beyond. 8 o'clock is when the polls close. If you've not had an opportunity to vote, you still have time, almost 2 hours to do so. I'm sure you can manage to squeeze it in and then come back and watch our coverage through the evening here as we bring you up to date once the votes start being counted in California's second gubernatorial recall election in 20 years, this one looking to take Gavin Newsom out of office as governor and to choose a replacement from a field of more than 40 candidates. We'll see you back here again shortly.